Data migrations are complex and irritating, creating days of frustration from setup to cutover. MoveBot was built from the ground up to fix that. MoveBot is the simplest, fastest tool for moving files and emails that there is. Fully hosted with no infrastructure, no virtual machines, none of that craziness. Sign up, connect, scan, and you'll be moving data in minutes. Move data like a pro at atmsp.link/MoveBot. If you're running an MSP and ever feel like you're constantly putting out fires, I've got some exciting news that could change the game for you. It's the Eureka Growth Program brought to you by Gozinta's Eureka Process, a sponsor of All Things MSP. And it's specifically crafted for MSPs at every growth stage. Imagine having a C-suite of advisors right at your fingertips, guiding you through everything from hiring to handling mergers, boosting your service delivery, and even planning your exit strategy. That's what this program offers. And let me tell you, it's like having a powerhouse team behind you, making sure that you're always ready for the next big opportunity. So if you're looking to elevate your MSP game, check out the Eureka Growth Program. You can sign up for a call with the Eureka team or shoot them an email if you have questions. Go to atmsp.link/Eureka to find out more. Hey everybody, welcome back to this All Things MSP Not Quite Live because we are recording this one in advance because when you're watching this, I will be at the ACES conference. If you're not familiar with that one, it is for primarily Apple consultants, but it's less tech, more business, kind of falls in line with what we do here at All Things MSP. And of course, that show is put on by Justin Esgar, who is the host of the All Things MSP podcast. So if you haven't checked that out, check that out. But tonight we are talking about shared responsibility. And when my guest brought this up, I was like, you know what? Shared responsibility is something that gets talked about a lot, but not in detail. We don't actually tell MSPs what they should be doing in terms of shared responsibility, both with their clients as well as their vendors, because we're in this new kind of ecosystem type structure now. It's not the channel that we all grew up with because it doesn't just flow one way from vendor to client. It's more of an ecosystem, and we all kind of have responsibilities as well as influence in our different partners inside of that ecosystem. So tonight, to talk about this topic is Raffi Jamgotchian. Raffi, how you doing?
Well, Eric, thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks for volunteering the topic. I really do. Like I said, I think this is important because, like we say, it's responsibility, and everybody does have a responsibility in this new ecosystem architecture that we're working with.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the way we've evolved over time, it's almost a little bit going back to your roots as being a consultant, and whether you're providing the product as part of your services, is that's something that's bundled in, or it's a vendor that's working directly with the customer. Either way, there needs to be some sort of better communication among the the three of you. If you look at it as your three-legged stool, all of those have to be in communication with each other. The vendor to the customer, the vendor to the MSP to the customer, etc. So I think all has to work.
Yeah, and you mentioned communication. Communication is vital for when you're making sure that everybody understands their own responsibilities. Now, you are, I think, uniquely positioned to talk about this topic because you work with some industries that require a high level of compliance and security. And so you've probably had more of these conversations than most MSPs out there.
Yeah, certainly MSPs our size, because of the uniqueness of the financial services sector. And I think that's coming along with some of the other industries now that have to fall under different compliances. Finance, I think, was a little bit of ahead of that, then healthcare somewhat, and now with CMMC. So you're seeing a little bit of that as well. And having that clarity of where the line, where you start, where you have to work versus what needs to be done by a customer, what needs to be done by a vendor. Any of those delineations needs to be really clear. Otherwise, and you don't want to have to go back to a contract every time you say, "Oh, well, that's not in scope of what we do." Having that really clear conversation up front and with each engagement is very important.
Yeah. And because each engagement is different, right? And so the
Yeah.
responsibilities are going to be different. Now, when you're approaching, say, a new client or an existing client that you're still in the process of onboarding, how do you normally approach this shared responsibility conversation?
The beginning is we start at the beginning, and we were actually going through this exercise with a company that we've recently been onboarding, and we talked about uh, two things. One is how does money flow through your business, and how does data flow through your business, and you look at those things, and you start uncovering different things that you may not necessarily already you may not know. So as far as you're thinking, okay, this is a company, they store their stuff on SharePoint, their Office 365 or G Suite or whatever. They use Box, they use this, they use that. And if you don't know that they actually have this portfolio management system that they're using online that they've directly working with that company, you may not understand necessarily what the implications of that are. So once you understand kind of how data flows and money flows through the company, you can start having questions about, okay, well, what are they doing? What are you providing to them, and what are they providing for you? Then you can get into things like how is that environment secured? How are you protecting yourself back and forth? Have we talked to the vendor yet about what their best practices are? I think sometimes we forget to ask the question to the products, whether it's products that we provide, like that you're selling through you, like a 365, or it's a product that the company is directly engaging with. To what's the best way to implement your product in a secure way, specifically for the risks associated with that company. Everyone's going to be a little bit different, and so having that conversation with that vendor uh, in an open way with the customer to understand, okay, if you do this, this is the capability that you lose, but you gain this, you reduce this risk area. Or are you willing to accept a little bit of risk in order to get this additional capability? All those things, all those conversations need to happen. Otherwise uh, you run the risk of people pointing fingers when things go sideways.
Yeah. And you pointed out something early in the conversation that it's kind of going back to our consulting roots, right? Those of
Right.
us who have been doing this long enough kind of understand what you mean. And that's because we were doing it back in the day, right? Before it became more commoditized, we were actually going in, evaluating an environment, evaluating needs, and then providing a solution. That has morphed over the years to providing more of a commoditized support structure, right? But I think you're right. It is changing now because technology is so critical to a business and it touches every single piece of their business. I was talking to somebody the other day about we're really acting or should be acting more, evolving into, I guess I would say, more of a CTO role. We used to call it a virtual CIO, but now I think it's really more of a virtual, or I'd rather call it a fractional
Fractional. Yeah, I agree.
CTO, type of engagement where we're going in again, evaluating the business, not just from a what they need to get done productivity standpoint and what tools they're using, but also you mentioned cybersecurity is one of them. But one of the ones that you mentioned, but I don't want to gloss over, is data governance,
Yeah.
right? How they're using the data and how risky their data is that they're using. So you mentioned finger pointing as well. Finger pointing is a problem, especially when you're talking about responsibilities. So obviously, this is something that needs to be covered in the contract as well. So, what are some of the things that maybe you would do as part of your agreements that go into, I guess I would say, enforcing the shared responsibility actions?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think um like most things, you have to have some sort of governing relationship with the customer. So if you have a properly structured MSA from, take your favorite IT services lawyer, then that can be enforced in your state. That's the structure that you should start with. All of these conversations need to stem from that master services agreement. So if your master services agreement, whether it's limiting your liability or you're also saying that, look, hey, if we're providing you this guidance on this thing and you decide to not accept it, that's your formal that's already your formal agreement that you're not accepting our specific recommendations or something like that. People talk about you're sending out a letter that says that you're abdicating responsibility or whatever. Those are really not that letter may or may not be enforceable unless your MSA is all that was already signed for and agreed to specifically identifies that that's the way that you're governing the relationship. So the relationship is governed by the MSA. If there's specific things that because of you're bringing in a new product that needs to adjust for within the scope of the services, you need to identify that and make sure that is amended to your contract. For the most part, the way we manage it is really kind of on a solution by solution basis. So if we are looking at something that we're providing, it's part of our SOW. So if it's part of our SOW, we're managing it. What's the difficulty sometimes is dealing now in this new more whether it's companies getting it through a marketplace, where they're directly getting it from a vendor, is managing that relationship. I'll use for in our world, we work with investment companies, as I said. So they're dealing with portfolio management companies. They're dealing with portfolio accounting systems. They're dealing with market data systems. A company like Bloomberg. So they have a contract with Bloomberg. The relationship is between them. We're just sitting there essentially on the side advising the customer on how to engage with that customer, with that firm. And it may be that we're there just to ask the right questions to make sure that they're using the product not necessarily only securely, but in the most efficient way, right? To the point of being a fractional CTO. If you're going to be a true fractional CTO or fractional CIO, you need to be that translator to that for that customer if they don't have somebody internally. So that's kind of the sense of it there for us. But the vendor is going to have to know what the best way to leverage their platform is, right? They're ultimately it's their product. It's not like you're building it. If you're building something in house, it's a different story. That's where the role of the third party vendor is. It's crucial that they come with some sort of implementation guidelines. Today, we're rolling out a secure password management solution, for example, for a customer. And one of the things that they require, it's not part of the solution necessarily, is that they want it tied into their single sign-on system. So uh, who's responsible for that? Well, the vendor is responsible to provide you information about how to implement that secure sign-on solution if that's the way you want to go. Um, they're not turning it on out of the box. That was a requirement that the company put on us to kind of put together. So there's the three of us working together. It may not necessarily be a conversation. It just be that here's the information. You just go do it. Come back to us with questions, and now that's a conversation between us and the customer. Um, the idea is still going back to what we said before about communication and transparency. It's like that's we're all working together. We're not adversaries here. We're all trying to make sure that the company is there to not only function properly, but be resilient and be as less risky as possible. The only way we can do that is if we're all working together.
Yep. And you mentioned how, it's a third party vendor situation. Sometimes the relationship between the client and the vendor is especially where the fiduciary relationship is.
Yep.
And that's where I think that ecosystem piece comes into it, is that it's more of a partnership of three rather than what it typically used to be in that, flowing from vendor to client. Now, one of the hardest things I would imagine for an MSP to control is users. And so a part of this has to be how the users actually interact with the company's data, and this would be, any type of phishing attempts, training for that, or how to share data securely.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you do around user behaviors to kind of help them mitigate that risk, even though the risk is technically on them because it's their people? I believe that as MSPs, we have a responsibility to do some type of training and at least knowledge sharing so that we've done our part in terms of that shared responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, if you're training or you're providing that knowledge transfer to the employees and they continue to exhibit risky behavior, um, there's only so much you can do at that point. There are human controls and then there's technical controls, right? You provide the technical controls where it makes fiscal sense to do so and where it's possible. Then you try to implement the human controls, and the human controls are really policy and education, right? So they accepted the policy. This is the policy. You're also educating them also on the policy and also the specific control about, don't click here for stuff. But there's always going to be folks that do that, and so it's really on the company to make sure that they have the proper um, uh, reaction to that. And that could be as simple as, hey, we have a sanction policy. You do this, 2 or 3 times, we're putting you in the risk pool and we're taking stuff away from you. You can't have toys if you're going to continue to break them. So that's kind of whether that's really kind of a conversation with that with the client for that. There's also another avenue of this, which is um, an outside entity. So one that's not even related to necessarily the three that we're talking about. And that's the idea of looking at frameworks as a way to help inform what you should be doing necessarily. And I'll use the example of CIS. So if you look at CIS has very specific guidelines and recommendations around how systems should be hardened and secured, whether that's a desktop, a server, or Office 365. So that's another avenue that an MSP can use. Say, hey, look, CIS has gone through this kind of painstaking way that this is the best way to implement some other product. It's not their own product, so it's a little bit different. This other product, Office 365, to implement it in a secure way. But these are the associated outcomes to that. So again, it's now it's a participant. It's still a conversation. It's still participatory. You're not just shutting things down for shutting down sake. It's the idea of you're now bringing in this third party to help assess and figure out what the best way to implement something like that is. Regulations are also going to be similarly affecting. Like if you're under CMMC, I'm sure, and it's not my area, so I'm going to be talking out my rear end here. But it's basically like, all right, so here are some things, some of it prescriptive or not. These are the things that you're going to have to do if you're going to comply. If the company continues to not want to comply, that's is how you have to decide whether or not that's a business relationship, of course, that you want to have, because they're potentially putting you at risk. But it's essentially on them. It's one thing that it's interesting. I don't know if you've come across this, Eric, with others, but we frequently are asked when we're working with a client that they have to identify somebody as a security officer in the firm. And I think most most frameworks have this kind of concept,
Right.
and regulations have this kind of concept, and they tend to want to ask us to be the security officer. Um, and that's mostly a non-starter. If you're being asked to be added as a security officer in documentation, in contracts, when they're talking to people, uh, it's okay if they're informing the company, the regulator, whatever, that there's the third party involved in an advisory role, but it needs to be somebody in the company that is ultimately the security officer. So if that's not a responsibility that they're actually taking on, um, then I don't know what is. So you're essentially saying, like, all right, I'm responsible as a security officer, but so you now have an incentive to work with somebody at the firm to kind of sort out these shared responsibility matrices kind of thing. So, um, going back to you were talking about, um, uh, the consultative stuff. It's interesting. So, you and I have been around this industry for a little bit. I started out as an MSP just because I didn't know any better, and seemed like it was the right way to go back in 2008 when we started out. And talking to some and knowing how we had interacted with uh, IT service providers when I was in corporate, it was very consultative, as you said. So it went from consultative to, then we created this MSP structure, and we almost went in this weird direction where it's like, all right, this is the box that we play in. We're going to provide these things, and then kind of not do anything else. And I think that held us back in many ways. And security partially is helping us move forward a little bit more into that consultative role, especially some of these regulations. So now the ecosystem has changed such that we're not the gatekeeper of technology anymore necessarily. And we now have to come back to becoming a consultant, and even maybe somewhat of a concierge of sorts, to help them identify what is it that they're using. Are they picking the right software? Maybe this isn't the right solution for them. What have you. So we're almost coming full circle back to that consultative relationship as well. Um, One thing that the I think the MSP has to understand as well is, secure guidelines. You're going to be looked at as the guy or gal to do that either way. It doesn't matter, unless you speak up and specifically say you're going to be expected to be the person that identifies what needs to be done from a security or just technology point of view. Um, uh, some of that's going to shift as these ecosystems change, but you're still going to be the person that gets the fingers pointed at, unless you speak up.
Yeah. And I think the smaller the business, the more that's true. And I think it's very important that you pointed out that they cannot abdicate those compliance responsibilities to someone outside their company.
Mhm.
There's legal reasons why it has to be somebody within the company, somebody who has usually decision making power, a director or above kind of thing.
Correct.
And there's one thing that I want to talk about, though, because this came up when you were talking about agreements and things like that, because technology changes, it changes at a rapid pace. Even if you have a year-long contract with a client, or if you have a month to month, right? You're not changing the text of that agreement very often, but the technology may change. They may add a new piece of technology. How do you adjust the agreement in those situations where a new shared responsibility needs to be defined?
I mean, look, if the company is hiring a copier vendor to bring in a copier, we're not, we have some shared responsibility there, but we're not adjusting agreements or anything like that. Um, However, if there is something that is of some material impact, sure, because now the nature of our engagement has changed. And if we're not, if we have to make an economic change, whether it's more time slash more money to support that customer, we need to have a different conversation when it comes to how that engagement takes place. So in that sense, yeah, that's now an amended scope of work. How often does that happen? It's rare. Um, it's largely, we've seen it where, especially if something is shifted from, say, an on-premise product that they've had when we first walked in the door to a new platform, or if, let's say, one of our non-financial customers shifted ERP vendors while we were working with them. So this was early on before we kind of niched down to financial. We had gotten a customer, one of our larger ones, and they had this old antiquated GL system. And we were part of the process to help them select a new one. But ultimately, we're not GL experts. That's not our thing. We brought in consulting services to help kind of take that over the finish line. But now that was a new company that we needed to manage and engage with. That Even though we weren't necessarily doing the work, they were now essentially kind of reporting to us. So if we're the CIO, all those vendors need to report to you as well, that are part of that ecosystem, whether the money is transferring through you or not. You need to take that. I think that part of it needs to take that. You have to take the reins on that. And
Yep.
so, because that engagement had changed at that point, we did adjust our agreement. Say, okay, now we're managing these additional vendors. That is a significant change. It's not just, like I said, the ISP or the copier changed. This is now a significant engagement, because now we're dealing with things that affected us in a way. For example, they had their own ticketing system. We had to now manage that with so clients were coming to us for tickets. If we couldn't solve it, we went to so now we're dealing with this whole other structure of how we supported the customer. So in that case, we did adjust our scope of work. Um, Similar, when a company, we had a couple of firms that went from, as I mentioned, on-prem to cloud for certain things. That's an adjustment to the way that you're engaging with that customer. So of course, yes, maybe it's the middle of a 3-year agreement, but there's no reason why you can't amend that agreement. That's what that's for. You have to decide whether or not you and the customer have to come to an agreement and say, look, this is now a material change to the business. You need to have that ahead of the time too. That it's not just like locked in. It's like, this is a material change. We need to make an adjustment.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to bring it up, because this shared responsibility is an evolving thing, and so your agreement needs to evolve with those things. And you're right. I think amendments are the right way to handle that. Now, we've talked a lot about the client side of shared responsibility. Let's shift gears for a little bit and talk about the vendor side. Now, one of the things I think that is very interesting about the vendor side of things is that we as MSPs have a lot more influence over our vendors than we used to. We used to have to just take whatever our vendors gave to us, or dished out down to us.
Yeah.
Now you see it a lot more common for an MSP, regardless of size, almost, to be redlining their agreements with vendors and asking for specific provisions. Uh, how true are you finding that? How important is vendor management, do you think, to this whole shared responsibility piece?
Funny you should bring up, like, vendor management was like one of those, really, when I first started out in the MSP world, that was like one of the key things that differentiated an MSP from every other IT service provider, was that we're going to help you manage your vendor ecosystem as it relates to technology. I think uh, Alex from Chartech had a famous saying, like, we'll manage your car wash guy if we can figure out a way to make money on that, and kind of thing. So it's like, it didn't. Well, that was the idea. It's like, we'll take care of all of that stuff. And I think we've probably vendor management has gotten more complex, and we've done less of it over time. It's gone to
Yeah.
like this. It's more important than ever. We're not doing it at all. And so, and I've been, I think I've been um, accused of being too harsh on some vendors sometimes, but we your customer is looking. You know, if they go around you and they hire a vendor, um, not much you can do about that other than try to at least solve for that problem. But if you're going to bring customers, if you're going to bring product in, or they're coming through you to at least be concierge to help them define what is needed and what have you, you need to have some baselines of managing that, not only managing the vendor going forward, but also some questions up front. You talked about, redlining contracts, but even besides that, um, I don't think we ever asked questions of our vendors before. Do you have, kind of the same questions that are um, look at the 500 to 400 questions that your insurance company asks you
Yep.
when you're trying to get cyber liability insurance. Those are a great place to start, asking what your vendors are doing. And if they're not forthright about that, and some will be, like, we did one with a fairly new company that we were implementing. It was funny enough, they're helping us with hardening devices. So figured, you're in the security workflow. We were going to ask you some security related questions. And so we put together a draft, a questionnaire, and we sent them. He goes, "No one's ever asked us these questions." He goes, and I said, hopefully that's going to change. Hopefully more people will be doing that, but we need to start asking questions to our customers, to our vendors. And included in that is sometimes, and they need to be transparent about it. I think it's okay not necessarily to give you the right answer. I think sometimes we run that our problem ourselves. Like we want to give the answer that they expect. Do you have a secure development life cycle? Maybe you don't. Maybe you only have one developer and he also puts the product into production. And so you're not ready to necessarily say, we're working towards that, or you can, but be upfront about that, and hopefully
Yeah.
the vendors to do that. Now, more established vendors they're either not going to answer you, or they're going to give you some boilerplate that they have. And that's okay. At least you've had that you've asked the question and you've gotten some response. Now you have to decide whether you're going to sign that contract or find somebody else. Um, I'm uh, I'm a big fan of that. I'm a big fan. Like, you want my money or you want my customers' money, and I'm going to be responsible for dealing with you. You need to ask some questions. You need to answer some questions, and that includes what I talked about before. Like, do you have secure configuration guidelines for your product? And if you do or you don't, that's, we just need to know that so that we can make appropriate risk decisions. Otherwise, how can you how what do we know what goes on behind their four walls and how they're implementing things? We've seen too many really big vendors like fall down because they were putting things out there that were completely insecure. And so, and who has to uh, pick up the pieces? It's
Yeah.
us and the customer.
And when we're talking about responsibility, right, you are taking on the responsibility of asking the questions. And so you've done your due diligence, you've fulfilled your responsibility. You asked, and then the vendor either answered or they didn't.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
regardless of the answer, they're responsible for that answer.
Yes. Correct.
And
Their lack of answering is their answer, essentially.
correct,
Yeah.
correct. And so that is not only fulfilling your obligation, your responsibility, but it's also mitigating your risk because you've done what the framework says you should have done.
Yes. Correct. And ultimately, it's whether it's shared responsibility as a whole, or defining what secure guidelines are, or ultimately if we're gonna be able to provide a roadmap for our customers to be resilient, these are all different avenues that need to, is it only shared responsibility? No. Is it only secure configurations? No. It's all of these things together working in harmony. And there's always going to be, it's always going to be messy. It's never going to be, you're going to get, it's always a book with missing chapters. And so for those missing chapters, you're going to have to decide whether or not that chapter is important enough for you to accept that risk and move on.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Now, Rafi, I know you've done a lot of industry work, especially with CompTIA. Are there any resources that you know of that people could use to kind of help them with this shared responsibility matrix?
Yeah, actually, we had CompTIA over the past, I would say, two channel cons has put together a number of resources around, first talking about the responsibility matrix, how to talk to your customer about the responsibility, putting together a responsibility matrix. Essentially, it was very centric around the the MSP to customer relationship. As opposed to the vendor relationship. I think the last channel con I ran a small panel of experts. I was just the guy asking the questions, really around how to manage third party risk, because that kind of fell into that responsibility matrix, because you're now responsible. If you're responsible for those vendors, you're potentially responsible for them. So having that conversation with the vendors, what to ask them, how to identify what's risky, what's not risky. Do we need to put vendors in all the same buckets, that kind of thing. So those are all the different, there some of the different material. In fact, probably a little bit of a prelude to the next channel con that the cybersecurity working group for North America is putting together. Um, a, Basically like a work manual of sorts that will include responsibility matrix as part of that, which will have, these are some of the things that, like, kind of think of it as the way I envisioned it. We envisioned it. In fact, it was the envisioned of Vince Chrysler from Solarian that kind of came up with this idea that, I don't know if you remember, you're about my age, Eric, right? So when you do you remember in elementary school when we had science, you would like walk up and there'd be like a sheet, a card that you'd pull out, and that would be like your experiment thing that you'd have to do. And they have
Right.
like, the purpose and this and that and all this, everything was like on one card. And so we were thinking kind of that same concept with cybersecurity, a couple pages where we would be able to, as you need certain things, you can pull them up and put them into your binder, essentially. And so the binder would be a living document that would include these things. Shared responsibility is going to be one of those items that we're going to be putting out a fair amount of content around. I think it's become even more important when we're not the sole gatekeeper of technology. If we're not the buyer of technology necessarily, it needs to be something that is um, important. One kind of as a to emphasize that. So we have a client of ours who's in the private equity space. Their main area of expertise is around SaaS companies. So specifically around this is more mid-tier and enterprise. And one of their companies happens to be one of these ecosystem companies. But one of the things that the studies that they did was that the CIO was no longer the largest consumer of technology in the company. It was actually the chief marketing officer. The chief marketing officer was the number one person in the company that was consuming the most technology, and they were making the technology decisions with the firm. Think Salesforce, Marketo,
Yeah.
Tableau, all these Ramp, all these things that came out of the CMO's office. They're now able to go direct to these companies and buy these things. So now shrink that down to a small medium company. that most of us are working with. Um, the the CEO, or maybe even one of their it's very easy to drop a credit card and buy services. Um, your uh, pick your favorite file sharing vendor or whatever. It's very easy to go direct to, one of these firms and just say, "Hey, here's my credit card. I want to sign up." And so, because of that, we need to live with that world. Yes, maybe you're not making a few points on that business, but you probably shouldn't be relying on that margin to run your
Right.
company. There's another place for you to make your business, but it's that because of that, we now have to be more involved in those conversations to understand where, going back where I started, was how does data and how does money work through your company.
Yep. And I think that's a great place to kind of wrap it up and bring it back to another resource that I want to point out is that the MSP committee last year created the MSP guidebook
Yep.
at CompTIA, and it does
Fantastic.
include a
Fantastic.
non-cybersecurity focused little guide and worksheet on vendor management. So look for the cybersecurity stuff that Raffi was talking about, the vendor management guide in the MSP guidebook. And of course, if you want to hear more about this, you can attend ChannelCon, which is the very end of July, very beginning of August in Atlanta this year. So, Raffi, of course, I'm going to see you there, right?
We will be there. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to it. Well, thanks, Raffi, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks. You too, Eric. Appreciate you having me.